The world lost an important voice in comics this year when Harvey Pekar passed away. You're among many cartoonists who illustrated his work, most notably Robert Crumb, which is what brings us here today, really, because of the Genesis exhibit. Can you tell us about your experience working with Harvey and whether or how his approach to storytelling impacted you?
Well, I know his work impacted my own in that I don't think anyone would have really, or I think he's obviously one of the first and probably the major proponent of autobiographical comics. And, I've done autobiographical comics, and it's not that you're thinking, oh, Harvey Pekar's done this, I can do it. But the fact that you've seen it around makes you think, you just begin to think of the possibilities. But when I first got into contact with him, I was working on the Palestine comic series, which, especially at the time, was coming out in individual comic books, the old pamphlet, 32-page serialized booklets. And it wasn't selling awfully well. And I got a phone call, and it was someone saying, Joe, this is Harvey Pekar. And I sort of worshipped Harvey, and I thought this was a joke. I thought, this is one of my friends calling out. And I was basically challenging, saying, Rick, I know it's you. But it wasn't Rick, it was Harvey Pekar. To tell him he liked my work, and he wanted to write about it. And then a while later, he contacted me and said, do you want to work with me? And to me, that was, gold-handed on a plate. Because I was very happy to work with Harvey. I definitely felt, until working with him for some years, I definitely felt the junior partner in the relationship, in that he would send these sort of storyboards with a stick figure with all these words above, and usually there were enough words in one caption to fill a whole comic book. And in those days, I was too sort of, in my own head, I was too insecure to say, Harvey, this needs to be a 4-page story, not a 1-page story. It took time before I could finally suggest something like that. But he threw me work, because we did stuff for the Village Voice, when I really needed the money. And it was a pleasure working with him, because he's kind of one of those really great original people. He'd call up and say, I figured out a way we could make some more bread. He showed me you shouldn't be ashamed of thinking of making money if you're going to make a living at art. In fact, it's really important to make money if you want to continue with your work. So I was very sad that he passed.
As I mentioned, Robert Crumb's Genesis exhibit is at the Portland Art Museum currently. I was really thrilled when the museum decided to exhibit this work. As far as I know, it's the first major exhibit they've had of a comic artist. Some of Crumb's work.
I was a bit more of a prude in my younger days.
I was just taking a guess, but I thought this could be an example.
I've lightened up. Well, I don't know if you've ever read Angel Food McSpade. Some of that stuff is pretty wild and out there, and even now when I look at it, I sort of tremble with what is going on in his head. Those images don't appear in my head. We're just very different people. But I've really learned to appreciate it and almost wish I had that freedom to my subconscious that he has. I do. I see that he can allow his brain to just flow down his arm and out his pen, and it comes on the page, where with me it sort of goes around my brain a few dozen times, and then it makes its way to the pen. So I really appreciate actually that. And seeing that exhibit, if you haven't seen the exhibition, you really should. It's absolutely humbling, because he's probably one of the greatest drawers in the world. Forget comics. He's actually one of the great drawers in the world.
Great. You just answered my next two questions. Okay. Unless you'd care to go into the exhibition a little deeper, your thoughts on
I don't know if I'll go into them deeper, except to say that he's obviously had a real influence on my work. There was a time when I was, a younger cartoonist, I thought I would like to draw like Robert Crumb. And the reason being, he seems to invest, and if you look at his work, you'll see it, he seems to invest every object with life. Everything seems to have its purpose. if he draws a fork, you feel like that's a fork and it's got a soul somehow. And so many of us are just sort of, mechanically drawing a fork, as if it's a drafting problem. And that's what I really appreciate about his work. And, if I have consciously taken a lot of influences from him, and hopefully over the years, a lot of it's come out of me, but I think what remains is really what I've needed from him.
Great. So my introduction to your work was through your serialized comic Palestine in the early 90s, which you have said was the worst-selling comic for Fantagraphics.
It was probably one of the
serialized-
worst.
Yeah.
They canceled others that were selling better than that. And, I think the last issue, there were 9 issues, and I think the last couple of issues might have sold 1,900 or 1,800. And you can only imagine that's making no one any money.
Yeah.
But they stuck with it. They
Yeah,
stuck
to their
with it.
credit.
Yeah, to their credit.
It was one of the best-selling titles at Reading Frenzy.
You might have sold several hundred, and that was so.
The work has been in print for the better part of the last 2 decades now, which is incredible considering kind of the early struggles. The 2001 edition included an introduction by the late Palestinian-American literary theorist and advocate for Palestinian rights, Edward Said, who said, "With the exception of 1 or 2 novelists and poets, no one has ever rendered this terrible state of affairs better than Joe Sacco," which is
I was
incredible.
pleased when I read that. I have to admit, Edward Said is someone I admire a great deal, so that really meant something to me.
And Edward Said definitely had his supporters and detractors on both sides of this conflict, as I think you do as well. You yourself wrote an impassioned foreword to the first collected edition, right, about the plight of the Palestinians. That was 2001. You've faced harsh criticism for alleged bias in your coverage and even the very way that you draw victims versus perpetrators. I've always felt that with Palestine, and perhaps more so with Footnotes and Gaza, that you've gone to great lengths to find the truth in these stories. And while you don't claim to be practicing objective journalism, you've really done your due diligence to corroborate stories and faithfully render them, in my opinion.